Welcome to Design Overtime, the podcast where we go beyond the surface level discourse and actually sit with the ideas that shape how we work as design professionals. I'm your host, Guy Segal, a design director in Toronto, Canada. And while my other show, Design Downtime, is about stepping away from work to live a fuller life, some topics are just too important to be reduced to a hot take or a LinkedIn post. They deserve nuance and a real conversation. That's what Design Overtime is for, and I'm glad you're joining us. And we have a returning champion, Pavel Samsonov, here today. Hey, Pavel.
Hello, nice to be back.
Yeah, so far you're 100% of our guests, so it's awesome. And I wanted to chat with you today about design process, because if there's one thing that designers like to argue more than, or maybe at the same level of the death of design, is the death of the design process.
I think that I'm a little bit biased because my talk at the Information Architecture Conference last month was about process, and my talk at Throughline Conference in January was about process, and before that I spoke at Evolve Digital about process, and before that I spoke at Button about process. So, you can call me Mr. Process, and anyone who says that the design process is dead, I would challenge them, and I would say, to what extent were you practicing the design process before the thing that you think killed design process has appeared? Is it that you have changed the way you work, or is it that you already worked this way and it's just a convenient point in time to say, actually, the thing that I didn't do, now everyone else is also going to stop doing?
I'll start with a very provocative question. What is the design process?
To me, the design process is essentially just a structure for making decisions. And I think a lot of people, when they hear process, they think of either something like the double diamond, which is not really a process. It's a mental model of what a process needs to be able to enable. Or they think of something like SAFE, which is horrible and which exists to drain your soul. And either way, they kind of think like, hey, this is a thing that is not helpful to me. It's a thing that gets in the way. It's a thing that tells me how to do my job. Yes, there's a lot of bad process out there. 90% of everything is crap. Sturgeon's law is one of the laws that I think is the most evidenced in our practice. It comes up everywhere. I don't think I need to prove to you that most things are bad. And most process is implemented in a bad way. And most process is implemented top down rather than bottom up, where someone says, we must now do 2-week sprints. And people sort of say, oh, all right, and then reorganize the way they work. But they don't see the benefit because the benefit is not for them. The benefit of a lot of process changes is managerial control. And that is why a lot of transformations inevitably drift back towards waterfall, is because that is where a lot of managerial control comes from. Whereas to me, process is a tool we use. It must be self-imposed. Otherwise, there is no point. Otherwise, people think, how do I get around this? How do I get around these requirements someone else is giving me? You should always, in order for process to be useful, look at it as a constructive constraint you place upon yourself in order to make good decisions. And a lot of those constraints look like loops. They don't look like stage gates. They look like, have I validated, and I hate that word, but that's the bare minimum. Have I validated my assumptions with someone who isn't me? Have I checked with users or just checked with stakeholders? Have I tried more than one solution before deciding this is what we must ship? These are all process things. And I think a lot of designers, especially those from a more traditional design education background, they don't think of them as process. They just think of them as, that's just how you do design. And then they come across organizational, cross-functional processes. And those processes place constraints upon them they don't like. And so whenever anyone says the process is dead, which, by the way, did not start with AI, every year, many hundreds of people make this claim and have been since 2007 or so, when the tech industry discovered that design exists, because IBO started selling these services to a broader set of companies. Obviously, a small number of companies like Apple suspected that design existed before that point, and a small number of people in other fields, for example, sales and marketing, were aware of design as sort of this thing that exists out there in the world, but it wasn't really integrated in any sort of way. And in fact, a lot of the troubles we have with process and a lot of the understanding of process that we have comes from that kind of agency-driven world, where I am an agency, I come to you, you give me a brief, I execute the brief, and then I give you the results of the thing that I did, and then you pay me, and then I leave and you never have to talk to me again. And that linear kind of approach has informed so much of our understanding of the process, even though from the very inception of that framework, companies started bringing designers in-house, and that framing stopped making any kind of sense. Because if you do that to anyone you actually work with in the same building, then you just walk away, you do a terrible job. You give up all of your influence. They will start changing things. They will never come back and get your help ever again. And all of you will feel bad about it. You need to think much, much harder about how you manage handoffs, whether or not there needs to be a handoff at all, when you engage cross functions. All of those things are process things, but we don't think of them that way. And we don't design them deliberately for the outcomes we want to have. We design them based on what someone wrote in a book 20 years ago that your manager has only caught up to reading today because they got a summary for it out of Claude. And so, of course, we don't get good results. And of course, people think that process is just the thing that wastes my time.
I worked at an agency once, and I kid you not, one of the client services people literally told me, make sure you do design thinking on this. And this is really a great example of process within an agency as a package that you get to sell to a client, or an expected measurable outcome that you sort of commit to as part of your deliverable. And it's, we're going to do this. We're going to do a process, and this is what you're going to get as a result of it.
And I was going to say, it's very production-oriented way of thinking. It's a mode of, I am selling you an output, and the way you know the output is good is because I'm also selling you the tasks that went into that output.
Exactly. Is that the origin of the design process? Like being able to package a predictable and repeatable way of working?
So I think that it's a very likely hypothesis. And in fact, I would say that most of what we do in the workplace and most, people management theory comes out of the assembly line and the factory. And, our good friend, Henry Ford, and I use the term good friend very, very loosely, came up with a lot of these principles. And management consultants doing time and motion studies throughout the 19th and 20th centuries came up with a lot of these principles. A lot of this type of work is conceptualized around, we have defined the outcome that we want, and now all that remains is for the team to organize around building it and sequence the work. So it is like project management with a capital P and a capital M. It's not product management. It's much closer to the way you construct a building than the way you write software. And of course, the great thing about a building or a bridge or whatever is that there's already a blueprint. You can even buy a blueprint for a building and be like, here's the thing we should build. Here's the list of materials we will need. All of that is known ahead of time. You have perfect predictability. You have perfect control. And all you have to do is sequence the work in a way that you don't start building the top floor before you finish the bottom floor. And none of that makes any sense for software. But we are always asked, when is this going to be done? How long is design going to take? How many interviews do we need to do? And how many iterations will we need to do so that we can have it done by such and such a time? And you often hear these stories of people getting haggled down by managers. People say, we will go and do 10 user interviews. And they say, can you do it with just 5? It's like, maybe? I don't know yet because I haven't done the interviews. I don't know what I'm going to learn. That's the point of discovery. If you want me to do it in 5, if you only have time for 5, I can do it, I can try and adapt what I'm planning into what we're going to do. But there's a difference between a process and a plan. And I think part of that instinct is just like, there's a sense of existing waste that, every system has waste, and the job of a manager is to push back against it, to see where those sneaky designers and developers are trying to sandbag expectations. And then we can go to our managers and say that, hey, we got the timeline down from this many months to this many months. And it sounds great up until you blow through that timeline anyway, and then you blow through the original timeline because you've been trying to plan building software like building a bridge.
I like the production line metaphor because it really talks about, as you said earlier, people see those design processes as linear motions through time instead of feedback loops over and over and over. We have the design process, or we have packaged design process that is sold by an agency, a consultancy to a client. And then, like you said, we have people starting to work in-house. Why are they using this process?
Well, I think a lot of the reasons designers were brought in-house in the first place is to try and push this kind of quote-unquote optimization. But at the same time, employers are looking for a guarantee not only of timeline, but also of quality. And like we had just discussed, a quality needs to have some kind of guarantee behind it. And if I do this process, then we will have a good outcome. It's a very common design argument. And I think that's the argument that taste comes out of as well, which I think we've discussed previously. It's another attempt to guarantee that we have created a good output. You don't need to test it. You can take my word for it because I have good taste / because I followed the process. We did all of the steps, and now we have produced the output, and the output is good. And if you can sell that thinking to a manager or an executive or a stakeholder, then yeah, sure, you can skip the entire process. Why not? If your job is solely to create the deliverable and the existence of the process for you is just to put a seal of quality on it, that hey, this is good because we did this stuff, then yeah, farm it out to an AI. I don't care. Clearly, you don't care either. You're just trying to rush to the end as quickly as possible, and you're trying to convince someone to take possession of it. And once they've done that, well, if you have any kind of responsibility for the effectiveness of your design, you are about to find out exactly why process is important. If you don't have any responsibility for the effectiveness of the design, such as, for example, if you are a consultant or you have a consultant relationship with the team you're helping, where they asked you to produce an output and you produce the output, then yeah, cool, whatever, get your bag and walk away. All you've done is you've essentially pushed the validation and the error correction and the iteration costs onto the person building the thing. And on teams that are structured in a certain way or orgs that are structured in a certain way, you can get away with that. But I think we should be honest that what you are doing is you are getting away with something. You're not doing a good job. You are doing malpractice. And the fact that there were no consequences for you personally doesn't mean that this is a desirable pattern that other people should try and emulate.
Do we have I don't want to say crisis, but do we have an issue today with how people get into the practice of design and how they learn how to do design that necessitates enforcing a process? Because otherwise we won't get anything near what you're describing.
So I think that one of the reasons that process gets a bad rap is exactly because of that. It's not historical. It is much more of a present day phenomenon where, people did go into boot camps and learn one extremely rigid way of doing things. And you can go online. And part of the reason I can go and boot up Claude Code and ask it to create me a design case study, is that there are so many templatized case studies out there that this thing was trained on, and it knows exactly how to follow this script, and it's mediocre because the script is mediocre. A lot of people, I think, when they think of process, and they think of, it's just the cookie cutter approach that you get from dropping a couple of $1,000 and a couple of months of your life onto a course on the internet. Yeah, that's not a process. That's, something very, very different. Yeah, a lot of people entered the field through that. A lot of people entered the field through traditional education, or even through education that's completely unrelated to design. I think one of the interesting things about how people come into the profession is from all directions. Developers or product managers often do switch and become designers for the same reason that designers often switch and become product managers or developers, which is that the grass always seems like it's greener on the other side. And that is, I think, not really the problem. The problem is that those people, once they've gotten kind of the basic set of skills that these types of programs or resources teach them, then come into an industry that is not designed around mentorship and not designed around training people. They come into an industry where essentially you are expected to hit the ground running in every single role you're in and just start delivering stuff. And oftentimes there is no feedback loop, and there's no understanding that the stuff you are delivering is not good. It's not fit for purpose. And quite frankly, one of the big issues is the build, measure, learn, quote unquote loop. And I say quote unquote because it never really gets to learn in most companies. You build and then you ship. And hey, look at that on the roadmap, which is not really a roadmap, it's just a release plan. On your release plan, the thing you are doing next is not measuring. The thing you are doing next is a different feature, and so on and so forth. And then you have your quarterly plan. And then, hey, by the time you're done that plan, you're already planning the next quarter. And the budget for all this stuff was already set out at the beginning of the year. And so the best case scenario is that you are getting around to fixing all the things that you learned went wrong the following year. More likely, you are never going to fix them. And a big part of that is because you're not encouraged to. We see that at places like Google, where all the star performers launch a thing, put it on their resume, put it in their promo packet, move on to the next project. Some poor junior is left to maintain it until it gets buggier and buggier, and then eventually it is sunset. In that framework, in that process, if you will, how are juniors supposed to learn? How are people supposed to find out that their decisions have consequences and they need to make better decisions, and they need a way that enables them to make better decisions? They can't. So to me, I don't actually think that the skill set of a junior designer came from a 4-year undergraduate program is really all that different from the skill set of someone who came in through another way once they've been in the industry for a couple of years. I think initially, at initial point, there's a huge difference, but the practical experience you gain, I think, makes so much more difference. And I will honestly say that a lot of the things that I learned in undergrad and in grad school, I was only really able to apply going into the 5 to 10 years of seniority kind of range in my career, partly because you don't have much control over what you're actually working on, partly because of just the structure of the company that I was in. So I would actually say that this is one of the ways that process is extremely, extremely valuable. And talking about process as though it's a thing that doesn't exist is very harmful to assimilating a wide range of experiences and a wide range of capabilities into the talent pipeline, and making sure that these people are learning the right thing. They're learning how to do good design. The other thing that happens is, and this is what I talked about at IAC, is if you say, oh, we have no process, you're actually doing is you're still practicing a process. It's just a shadow process. It's not defined well. It's not accountable to anything. You don't actually measure any of the outcomes of that process. And you're training the juniors that you're working with to do things the same way. And I called it the process of least resistance because that's basically the determining factor, is what is easiest for me to do in this moment. That is also a framework for making decisions, and therefore it is also a process. But no one is coming out and saying that I'm doing this because it's easiest. I'm doing this because it's the most obvious next thing to do. They're making up some reason for why they're doing it. And ultimately, the result is that there's no accountability for why anything happens.
I like that you mentioned mentoring and you talked about the education element of design, because for me, I've seen a lot of, boot camps and people going into the industry. They learn a process. They learn like, this is how you do design. And as you said, a lot of it is reflected in case studies, which is exactly, this is the process I learned, and here I'm communicating it to you, the reader. I've seen a lot of build measure. I have rarely seen any sort of education program that even mentions the learn and the feedback loop afterwards. It's very rare to see it in a workplace. And if people don't know that it exists, maybe they know it in theory, but no one really teaches them, okay, you've done maybe tiny loops of build, measure, learn as before you deliver. But once you deliver and it's out there and people are actually using it, real people, you're moving on to the next thing, as you said. I think a big part of it, or something that could have tackled it, is if the design industry had a more formal certification program where, you know what, you finished your first 3 years as a designer. Here is the next set of things you need to know. That you no longer, that thing that got you in the industry, that first initial process of how to just do basic things is no longer serving you. Here is the next level that you need to know. And I think that is completely lacking.
I think that the same can be said for pretty much any other function in our industry. I don't know if certification is the right way of going about it. I would say that certainly software engineers are probably more important to certify than designers are. I am generally not a huge fan of gatekeeping any profession. I mean, outside of things like law and medicine, where the certifications exist for a very important reason, I kind of think that for a variety of reasons, it's just an unnecessary burden in a lot of cases. But I do think there needs to be a general community sense of accountability for the work we do, and a general community sense of how to behave in an acceptable way. There was a piece I featured on my newsletter, The Product Picnic, in the latest issue around this thing called the picturing relation. The piece talks about engineers hacking. I think it is equally applicable to designers. And essentially what the picturing relation is the connection between the thing you are working on and reality. And the framing of the piece is that owning the picturing relation gives you power over an employer. Otherwise, the employer has all the power. They can restructure your team. They can put you in a different project. They can fire you, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't control reality. They cannot control the effectiveness of the system that they currently have, except insofar that they hire people to change it. And they hire people like software developers, and they hire people like designers. And one of the things that maintains the importance of that picturing relation is that we have a duty to the people who inhabit reality to build a product that works for them. And as soon as we give up on building a product that works for people, we start to lose our grasp on that lever of power, on that influence, because our relationship to reality essentially starts to unravel. We start to focus more on, do stakeholders like it? Does it hit, business metrics? Does it make the number on the dashboard go up? And once you've done that, you've given up your power over your employer. Your employer controls the dashboard. Your employer controls the way that score is calculated. Your employer controls whether a stakeholder likes something or not. So once you've reduced your impact to delivering on tasks that internal people demand of you, then you've given up any influence and you've given up essentially the thing that makes you useful and the thing that makes people in tech command a premium salary. Like, let's be honest. Developers make more than designers, product managers make more than designers, but even designers make more than a lot of the people who work in the same building as us, the same hours or longer hours on the same product. And the more we, give up on this community standard and this level of acceptable conduct, the more we give up that thing that guarantees that higher salary. And, at the end of the day, we live in a world where you need to work and you need to make money to have a house and to have food and all those other things. And, undermining the thing that lets you get more of those things is really, really stupid and short-sighted and counterproductive.
I totally agree with you. And maybe certification is not exactly the way I would put it, but definitely think there's another pet peeve of mine is the endless cyclical nature of the discourse in design, that we have to revisit the same what is the fold and what I would consider solved problems every now and then, because there is no agreed upon codified body of design education. But mentoring for sure is something that is sorely lacking within the industry. Another thing that I see that I don't see enough of is applying the same build, measure, learn, or feedback loop to our own work. And I think a big reason why we have the design process or different design processes at different organizations is exactly because people don't stop to evaluate, are the steps that I'm taking in my work, are they bringing me closer to where I want to be? Are they the right steps to take?
I think that we covered this ground a little bit when we talked about Agile last time we talked. And I think it's exactly the same problem, is that people adopt processes for the sake of having done so. They do 2-week sprints because the book says to do 2-week sprints. And then they say, we did 2-week sprints, therefore we did a good thing. We checked off another box on the list of best practices. I hate that concept of best practices so much. Sure, there are the conversations about, what's above the fold and do users scroll and so forth that are kind of settled and people bring them up. The problem with people bringing them up is they're not actually relitigating them. The problem is that they're making the same argument over and over and over because they aren't well read enough to have seen that other people have made the same conclusion 50 years ago. We kind of get to a point where people just implement these best practices and they say, this is a good practice. This is the best practice. Therefore, we must do this. And what you said is like, people don't evaluate whether the best practice meets their goal. I think their goal is to adopt the best practice, which is a terrible goal to have, but they haven't really thought about it. They kind of just, started from an output-driven understanding of their process and understanding of transformation. Is we need to be doing the thing and not why are we doing the thing? What is the thing accomplishing for us? You can get a certification in Agile. Does that help anyone? No. Most of the people who are Agile certified that I've worked with had this exact approach to every single problem, that we will go to the book and we will do what the book says without really having a very good understanding of the context in which the book says to do that. And I think a lot of the books actually don't talk about the context at all. And so they arrive at a point where they think that we must deploy this pattern everywhere. It is the best pattern. It is the thing you must do. One of the upcoming issues of the product picnic, I think I'm going to have to deep dive into quote unquote best practices and why you should never do them unless you have a really, really good and compelling reason, because the conditions for which that practice was best are extremely narrow and you are not necessarily experiencing those conditions. You are not Amazon, you are not Meta, you are not Google, you are not solving the same problems they are solving. Stop trying to ape the patterns and the paradigms that they've created to solve hyperscaler problems.
When we're talking about best practices, I think there's a lot of, I've seen them in two very distinct contexts. One is a political context. Like, I need to sell this idea, and I'm using best practice as a way to prove that this is the right solution. The other thing that I've seen is used as a heuristic, as a shortcut. I have a million things I need to consider in this. How can I short circuit it? Things do I not need to put as much emphasis on, and instead worry about other things that are maybe not as established? I think a big issue that I see with those things, and you sort of touched on that, is the fact that because we don't have a book that you can buy that says this is UX and has all those things in it, when I look at something that says, when you design search, this is how you should do it, I have no idea who decided that this is the best practice. I have no idea whether they did a year-long research study or whether they saw one anecdote online and said, okay, yeah, that makes sense for us as well.
I think even worse, there are best practices for doing things that you should never do. And people say, well, we are doing the best practice. You see this a lot whenever synthetic users come up, where people are like, we are doing the best practice synthetic users. Well, the entire concept is essentially fraud. You are falsifying data, you're falsifying insights. There is no best practice because the practice itself is garbage. And you're just trying to hide the fact that you're doing something stupid by saying, well, this is the best way to do this stupid thing. Okay, sure. Yeah, okay, whatever works for you. You're trying to, like you said, you're trying to sell the wrong solution by saying this is the best way to do the wrong thing. But you're just going to be more wrong. There's Peter Marholtz brought this up a while back around the thing that is actually missing from design is rigor. And I think a lot of people substitute process for rigor or best practices for rigor, where they say, we did the best practice, we did the thing, we did design thinking, in the sense of we did something and then we called it design thinking, and therefore the outcome is good. And I would say, if anything, that's the opposite of rigor. The thing they are attempting to do is to take AI as the ultimate example of everything, for the past 4 years. The rigorous thing to do, and everyone tells you to do this, is whenever you use AI for anything, check the results. Go and see, does it have sources for all of its outputs? Do the sources actually say what the thing claims they say? And so on and so forth. And every single set of instructions will tell you to do this, and no one actually does this. And the reason no one actually does this is because if you actually did this, you would spend more time, you would spend more effort than it would have taken for you to do the work yourself. And people will do spot checks, people will skim, and inevitably you will miss things. And trying to come up with various rules for, we're going to have another model, check this model. Okay, that's not rigor. The rigorous thing to do is to check the work yourself, and you're never going to do it. Whereas if you're doing it yourself, the doing is the checking. This is a Deming thing, the culture of quality. QA at the end is always going to take more time than a total understanding of quality at every stage of the process. If quality is built in to how every stage is done, then by the time you get to the end, QA is not necessary, because there is any issue that has snuck in has already been caught. The problem with doing all the QA at the end, it always takes time. It's always a blocker. It's always a gate. People try to go around the gate. They think, oh, QA is slowing us down. No, the thing that's slowing you down is that you are doing bad work. If you were doing good work, you would be moving faster. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast is a cliche, but it's true. And that, to me, is the thing that a good process enables. It allows you to avoid the steps that try and retroactively make up for the rigor that you decided not to pursue. But if you have the process in place, if you're actually practicing it, you don't need those gates. You don't need someone else to come and check your work because you've built trust and you've built authority through doing it right, which I think is completely different from trying to claim unearned trust and claim unearned authority by doing something that is a best practice and just saying, well, we did it, therefore it's right. No, you need to check. You need to be checking all the time. It needs to be a feedback loop. And there's no process in the world that can substitute for having done that.
I'm hearing two things when we talk about process here. One is that you're always doing some sort of process. Unless you're doing nothing related to design or research, you're always doing some activities that are your process, whether you call them process or not. You're doing something. I think the stronger process or the best processes are the ones where the designers came up with the steps they need to take, and they have ownership and agency over what they're doing instead of someone from the top deciding this is going to be how you do design at this company.
I think that's honestly a very important point to differentiate that last point is there are a lot of things we do because other people told us we had to do them and we had no opinion. Design working 2 weeks ahead of engineering. No designer came up with that. I promise you. Some product managers said, this is what must happen, and we didn't have an opinion, and so we said, okay. And now it's a best practice, somehow. Well, why? Why did it come to be? Did anyone test and see if that was a good idea? Where is the measure and learn part? Where is the retrospective? And I think that a lot of these kind of assumptions, it's really like folk superstition, basically. Like, oh, everyone knows that, it's bad luck if a black cat crosses the street in front of you. Everyone knows that design should work 2 weeks ahead of engineering. Those two statements have equal validity behind, which is to say none at all. But people have kind of just aligned around the idea that other people think that, no one is going to disagree with me if I come in and I say engineering, design should work two weeks ahead of engineering. No one is going to disagree with me if I propose a best practice, but proposing anything else requires risk, requires evidence, and that stuff is hard. And it's easier not to do it. It's easier to just say, well, this book that everyone read says to do this, therefore we must do it too.
And I see a lot of people when they say the design process is dead, or I hate process, I never want to do process again, whatever that means. They usually come at it from a lack of genuine self-reflection, in the sense of the process as it's currently defined for me is not really working. And instead of interrogating what's not working and why it's not working, I'm just going to chuck it all out and do whatever. And of course, subconsciously adopt a process that makes more sense to me without calling it process. Another thing that I see is that it happens a lot with seasoned designers or people who've been doing this for a while. Something natural that happens is as you practice something over and over and over, eventually you come to rely less on a rigid set of instructions, and instead you're much more comfortable improvising and adapting some of those tools to the specific needs of the moment. I think people who are doing it and then they say the design process doesn't work, they're not realizing that they're in this quote unquote privileged position of being able to not follow the process verbatim, but they're just not aware that they're doing it.
Yeah, there's this concept in education and learning science of rote expertise versus adaptive expertise. Often people think of it, this is kind of, I think, a problem with the maturity ladder model in general, that you must go through each level of a thing. And on this kind of ladder, they're both types of expertise. And so you kind of get, I think it's like not level 3 and 4. 1 is total novice. 3 is like 2 is your learning stuff. 3 is rote expertise. But rote expertise is basically you just studied the steps. You know that in this situation, you must do these steps. As soon as you are faced with a different situation, you can't adapt. And studies have shown that you're actually worse off as a rote expert than as a learner when it comes to developing adaptive expertise, which is exactly what you're talking about, where someone understands why the steps are done and someone can choose, how do I deploy my toolbox to meet the moment, given the context that I have now that is not the same context as the context I faced before.
So what has worked for you in the past, working with teams, leading teams, working with other people in design? What has worked for you to establish a process, a design process that was not seen as constraints, essentially?
There's actually something that I'm doing this summer with Active Voice HQ. There's a workshop that we're hosting in Philadelphia on July 31st that is exactly about this. It's exactly about how do you essentially sneak in a design process when your stakeholders say, oh, process, I don't want to do it. It's inefficient. It's a waste of time. It's just farting around with sticky notes. And the kind of 5-second summary of a full day event is you need to stop using words they don't know and start using words that they know. Guess what? You're not hosting a workshop. You're scheduling a meeting. And the fact that a workshop is just a meeting with rules, well, you can adapt those rules. You can, as long as you understand what you want, you can do different things to get that thing. To get those outputs. If you want people to, give you their perspective and share their goals and share their domain expertise, there are so many different ways you can get that. It's not required that you get everyone in a room and get out the sticky notes. It's one of the ways that you can do it, but by far not the only way. It's not even, I would say, the best way. And so whenever you have stakeholders that are not really into it, you need to figure out, how do I explain the goal of what I want to do in a way that makes sense to them and in a way that they share that goal and they can tell they share that goal. Because, and this is something that I say all the time, and it's quite controversial, I think that people want to build good products. Not just designers. We don't own building good products. Developers want to build good products. The whole thing about Agile is, how do we reorganize ourselves to build a product that is good? Product managers want to build good products as well. There's a lot of different ways they try and achieve that. Those ways don't always look like the ways that designers want to do it. And so at the end of the day, you need your stakeholders, before you do anything else, align with you on what are the goals we're trying to achieve. And if you're flexible around what you call things, and you're flexible around how you get there, as long as you agree on those goals, well, that's half of the job already done. And then you can start slowly introducing different ways of doing things, different processes, different tools, not as one big linear, we are going to do a 6-month design thinking project kind of pitch, because you will be laughed at and thrown out of the boardroom, but as incremental, small, tactical things that eventually fit together into bigger and bigger pieces, where you can say, well, now that we have this outcome, we can use it as an input into this other step that we are doing, as long as at each step you're delivering something that's clearly valuable, that's clearly driving decisions and clearly driving outcomes. And I think a lot of process definitions miss that. I've done so much very kind of classic design thinking type work for customers, where they will say, we want a service blueprint. And I'll say, why? And they will say, we want a service blueprint so that we can have it. Essentially, the understanding of most design deliverables is that it's a cool thing to have. No one has any understanding of, how does this artifact help me make decisions? They don't understand that. Then, yeah, it is wasted. There was no reason to make that. You've just, essentially made wallpaper for a page on their Confluence wiki. That's not valuable. Don't do that. If you talk to them about, what are you trying to do? Well, we're trying to make this decision. Okay, what would help you make that decision? Well, we need to know if, X, Y, Z. Okay, let's figure out how we can find out how to get there. And now you've started to kind of build a chain of logic from a business objective down to a trailing indicator, down to a leading indicator. And then you can say, okay, this leading indicator is influenced by this user behavior. If we can change that behavior, we can drive the change. That's our hypothesis. We might be able to create that change in user behavior with this feature. Now you've got a feature that's linked all the way up to a business objective and a company goal without having run a workshop, without having described anything of what you're doing as design. And this doesn't have to be ironclad. It doesn't have to be, like researched and scientifically validated. It just has to be a causal chain of sensible assumptions that you can then go and test. And then you've built a thing, and you can go and say, hey, we built this thing and we changed this user behavior, but the change in the user behavior didn't drive the metric that we thought it would drive. And now you're actually doing build, measure, learn, as opposed to what you were doing before, which is build, 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 go to the next job.
I definitely agree on the issue of design artifacts for design artifacts' sake. I think that's why we see people go against personas or journey maps or, as he said, service blueprints, because they were created because the process said you need to create them. And they're not used to make better decisions or ensure that people are aligned on a set of knowledge that is required of them to make those decisions.
Absolutely. There's a conversation I was part of earlier this week on LinkedIn where someone was saying, one of the things that is dead now is lean. If you're familiar with skateboard and car kind of diagram, I hate that diagram for a lot of reasons. But this person was saying, well, we can just now use AI to build the car. No, you can't. And the reason you can't do it is not because, the car was difficult to build and so you built the skateboard. The reason you build the skateboard is to find out more about your customer's needs. You're making a small investment in order to study the customer behavior, how they use that skateboard. And then you find out, for example, actually, it turns out they needed to carry groceries. They needed a trunk. You didn't know they needed a trunk for this. And so I think all of the different design artifacts is kind of exactly the same thing. It's a cheaper and better version of your MVP. It's something that you can build to learn very, very quickly and very, very cheaply that will then feed back into redefining the requirements. If you haven't done that, you get the Homer Simpson like ridiculous green car from that episode where they bankrupted the car company doing this thing. And then you have to take out all the different features no one wanted just because you added them because they were really easy to build. But you didn't know whether or not those things were necessary. And I think there's generally a sense of, we don't need process because we can just have good ideas and then we can build and ship those ideas. Hey, guess what? Where does the idea come from? It does not come from divine inspiration. It doesn't come from good taste. It doesn't come from just being really smart. It comes from a process of discovery and identifying needs. And then, grounded in that, you can start figuring out, how do I fulfill those needs? Otherwise, everything you are doing is waste. And being able to create more waste more quickly is not valuable. I think a lot of designers, and especially developers, and this takes us back also to the agile conversation, have this attitude that the product manager's job is to define the thing we are building, and then we are going to deliver it. And sure, okay, you don't need the design process for that. That's not what it's for. And so, yeah, of course they're going to say design process is dead. Like I said, they've never practiced it. They are just doing delivery. They're just doing pixeling up of the idea that their product manager had. And yeah, for that, you don't need wireframes because the idea already exists. You don't need to do a smaller version of the idea. If your goal is deliver the whole thing, you can just, you can go and do it. And that's why designers are now panicking that their product manager is able to vibe code an entire prototype on their own. If that was your value proposition, you should be worried. The problem is that that's not actually valuable. The thing you were doing was pointless already. It's just that now there's a machine that automated doing it. And people can realize much more quickly than they used to that it was a waste of everyone's time. And now it's wasting a machine's time and it's wasting tokens rather than wasting your time and wasting a salary. But it was still always waste. If you're actually engaged in the process of understanding what is it that we need to create in the first place and what purpose does it serve, then nothing has changed. You still need a robust and rigorous design process to de-risk all of those steps and to make sure that the thing you're delivering at the end is not waste. And you can do that much more quickly with a wireframe or a storyboard and 5 people you can go to talk to than you can by trying to vibe code a prototype and then trying to deploy it into production, trying to set up your A/B testing flags. And at the end of the day, you're going to have the same answer, which is we built the wrong thing. And so it's much, much faster to find out you built the wrong thing with a sketch than it is with vibe code. And it doesn't matter how smart the model is. It doesn't matter how quickly you can get it to do what you want. It doesn't matter how lucky you get that its interpretation of what you asked for fits with what you actually wanted, because it's always going to be faster and cheaper to just jump on a call with one person who says, I would never use this.
I think that's a very fair point. And I think when I talk about the design process, I'm very careful to stay away from here are the steps you should take and instead focus on, for lack of a better term, conditions you need to meet. What are the conditions I need to meet as a designer to ensure that this is the highest quality product? I need to figure out why we're building it. I need to figure out, do we even need to build it? I need to figure out the people who are going to use it, how do they think about using it? All the things that are the sort of the bread and butter of what a designer needs to help others understand. And then you figure out like how you actually want to do it. You figure out what the tool or the step or the activity you're going to do, whether it's stickies on a whiteboard or whether it's co-creation with users or anything like that. But the important thing is that you did not skip those conditions that had to be met.
Yeah, I think that in a way, leadership sees those different ways of de-risking as fungible. As long as we have some confidence that there is no risk, we'll move forward. And we can build that confidence through a design process, or we can build that process through a designer saying, I have good taste and you're totally good to go. Or we can build that confidence through an AI telling us that you're brilliant and just invented a new branch of physics that makes the thing you want possible to do. All of those things, as long as you trust them, are equally valid. But this is what brings us back to the picturing relation, is that 2 of those things are controlled by the company and only one of those things is not. And the only thing that's not is validation with real people that is open to the possibility of a no. And that's really the problem with taste and with all of those kind of arbitrary, because I did this process, decisions around de-risking, is they're not really prepared to give you a no. They're not positioned and they're not designed to say we should not do this. They are designed fully and entirely to justify doing the thing that your stakeholders wanted to do in the first place. Jonathan Corman calls this decision-driven evidence making, which is, you figure out what it is that your stakeholders want to do and then you justify it. You find the data that backs up what they're doing. And there's so many different ways to do that, down to p-hacking, which is very scientific in the sense that unethical papers do this to get the results that they want, which is where you keep doing your testing until you get enough results that support the thing that you want to do, and then you stop the testing. It's like if I decided to do 100 user tests and my first 5 user tests were positive, cool, I'm going to stop. I'm going to say I had a 100% success rate, not open to the fact that I might have just gotten lucky and the next 95 people would have told me this was a terrible idea. And so I am magically able to increase my success rate from 5% to 100 just by cutting off the test at that point. And there's less subtle ways of, putting your finger on the scale. But what all of that results in is you have created an environment. You've created essentially a process that says yes to everything. You need to create a process that is capable of saying no. Not just in theory, but if you said no, then you could actually do something about it. Because this comes back to exactly what you were saying when you were saying that as a designer, we need to have this kind of set of answers in the course of doing our work. And so one of the answers is, are we certain that this works? To which the corollary is we need to be able to figure out, how will we know if it doesn't work? We need to ask that question before we do the work, before we ship it, so that we can actually, if what you're doing is analytics based, we can actually instrument the product to do that and to gather that data. But the second question that must be a companion to that first question is, if we find out we are wrong, what are you going to do about it? And in most places, in places where you kind of have that roadmap or release plan stacked with back-to-back features, the answer is nothing. You can do nothing because there's already, budget allocated for the next feature. The entire team is supposed to stop working on the thing that was built before you actually put it out there. And so it doesn't actually matter whether or not you've measured it. In fact, measuring it is detrimental, because if you haven't measured it, you can use things like the stakeholder liked it, or you can use things like we followed the process to declare success, to shy away from reality and say that, no, we actually did a good job. And we know we did a good job because the VP said it was good, and because we did the design thinking step by step, and because, we did agile to build it. But if you actually go to the analytics and you suddenly find out that, hey, this cratered our engagement, that's extremely dangerous knowledge, because the organization is not set up in a way to act on that information, except to punish the people who brought back that result to leadership. And that's going to be you. And so you're actually incentivized to avoid rigor and to avoid ever finding out that the reality disagrees with what you consider good. And when you've done that, when you've optimized your practice around that, you've given up any influence that you have. Then designers go and they say, oh, the product manager told me to do this. The product manager has more power than you. This is why the product manager has more power than you. And it's because you've given up on the idea of a rigorous design process.
I know you used reluctantly the word validate earlier, a word which I really don't like to use when it comes to that. I much prefer test a hypothesis or explore for probably the same reason. How do you create a process that has the built-in ability to disprove a hypothesis made by product or executives?
One of the things that I like to do, if I have the opportunity, if I'm working far enough upstream, is to actually go through a set of templates to define a hypothesis that can be tested. And this is like the number one thing you learn about science in like first grade, is a hypothesis must be falsifiable, in the sense that you make it and you test it, and the test needs to be able to tell you that the hypothesis is disproven. You can easily make a hypothesis that is not disprovable, and then you can go and say, cool, we validated it. Well, you didn't learn anything. You need to be able to say ahead of time, we are going to do this, and we expect this to happen as a result. Separately from that, you need to also determine, and that result that is going to happen is valuable to us. That's not a given. Quite frankly, that part is not design's responsibility. Our responsibility is to create a customer experience that lets the customer do a certain thing. Whether or not that thing is valuable to the business is the responsibility of the product manager, and it's the responsibility of the VPs and the stakeholders that are in that conversation. Our job is to say, we are going to help more users do this thing. Click on this button that we have in our product, or get some information out of the product, or put some information into the product, or whatever it is, whatever your business model is, our ownership of it stops at that point. And as long as you have that connection to the rest of it, that's not really something you need to focus on, but you need to kind of get the team to that point. And if they can't tell you why that thing, that behavior is valuable, then you can push back and you can say, well, then why are we building it? Because that often gets turned around on us in situations where designers are asked, oh, what's the ROI of design, which in various iterations has persisted to this point since the beginning of time. Then we kind of get this question pointed at us of, well, why, all these activities you've enabled, all these buttons you've added to the product where people can click, what's the value of those buttons? Well, that's not our job to determine that value. It is the job of the people who hired us, essentially, to decide what the business case is for having design and what the business case is for having built that button. And so you kind of get this backwards situation where stakeholders have ideas, they come up with ideas for buttons, and then they ask you, what's the business case for this button that I want you to put into the product? Well, no, that's backwards. That's not the way it should be. You should come up with the business case, and I should tell you that the best way to achieve that business outcome is putting a button into the product. And so the hypothesis-driven approach, if you search hypothesis-driven design and my name, you could probably find it somewhere. I've done a couple of talks on it, but essentially it kind of gets people to that point where it's like, well, you want this idea in the product. Okay. Why? What are you expecting it to do? And just the act of getting people to put that on paper. Well, first of all, that's a paper trail that you can then say, you told me that this would happen. I didn't invent this. So the fact that we tested it and it didn't work, and we quote unquote wasted 3 months of the roadmap is not on me. My job was to get the user to do the thing. So you create a paper trail, but also you get it out on paper. You get someone to essentially make the first lowest possible fidelity prototype, which is a sentence that describes what is supposed to happen. And then they can look at that prototype and they can say, hang on, that doesn't actually make sense. But unless you get them to physically write that out, they're never going to realize that. And that's one of the, I think, the powers of design, irrespective of drawing pictures, is just making a thing tangible in any way that you can. Content design, essentially, because it's text, but you can kind of add content fidelity without adding visual fidelity and get a lot of this benefit, because it doesn't matter where the label is or what the color of the label is. What matters is the text of the label. And if it's the wrong text, the thing you want to happen won't happen. And so if you have a stupid hypothesis and you're forced to write it out and you're forced to put your name against it, it kind of creates an extremely natural friction that gets people not necessarily not doing that idea, but it gets them to refine the framing of the idea, at least by a notch. And yeah, some ideas, it'll stop outright. If you're kind of then stack ranking those hypotheses, the stupid one's going to come last, regardless of who wrote it, because no one wants to be on the hook for delivering that when they can see that it's not actually, something that makes sense.
Essentially, what you're describing is, again, another step that designers need to do in, call it process, call it not, they need to articulate what the intent is.
And I had a post on this recently around, people love to say, and when I say people, I think it's most of Jared Spool, says that everyone is a designer. Okay, that means every single artifact is a design artifact. And every single design artifact is subject to critique and is subject to a feedback loop of refinement, including the brief that tells you what to do. And a brief has a goal. And in fact, you are the user of the brief, because the brief is telling you, here's a thing you can do that is valuable to the company. And that is doing a thing that's valuable to the company is a goal of you as a designer, because it satisfies your requirement to have a job. This brief is a product that is enabling you to meet that goal. If the brief sucks and it's not clear what the value is, then the brief is not fit for purpose, and you can take it back to your stakeholder and you can say, can you clarify some things for me? And you can make it tactful. You can say, for example, I would like to be able to explain this to other people. Can you explain this to me so I can explain it to others? Like, I get it, you get it, but I want others to be able to get it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. You can do something tactful like that and kind of nudge them on, okay, so what is it that you actually want? And how do you know it's going to be effective? And, there's a balance of covering your ass versus actually getting them to articulate something useful that you need to strike depending on your situation. A lot of us, I think, are in circumstances where it's far more important to protect yourself because it's not possible to do good work because your environment's not set up for it. Others have well-meaning executives and well-meaning stakeholders who just have never worked with a designer before and don't know what they're supposed to do. And when that happens, process is so useful, not because it gives them control over predictable outputs, but because it gives them guidance on what inputs are expected from them. And that's something that a designer straight out of school is not really equipped to provide, because they think, oh, this person is so senior, they're going to tell me what they want. They don't know what they want. They don't know what a designer needs to deliver something that they can sell for money. They're going to do their best. And if they see that you're not asserting yourself, they will assert themselves into that vacuum in the wrong way, or in a way that is not helpful for you. And so a big part of why having an explicit process that is telegraphed really, really well, a big part of why it's important is it creates an interface, essentially. Not a software interface, but a service interface between you and other parts of the company. And other parts of the company now can see that, okay, if I want design to do something for me, first of all, here's what I get out of it. Here's why I want to engage with design. You will never get anyone to want to talk to you if they can't see what's in it for them. But you also want to be able to telegraph, and here are the things I need. You don't want to have a situation that's like you go to the, DMV to renew your driver's license and you find out you didn't bring the paperwork and that you just wasted your time and you wasted their time. And you don't want the same thing to happen with designers, where a stakeholder will come to you and give you a brief that sucks and doesn't have any of the necessary information in it. And so the more of that interface you have that is more explicitly laid out, not necessarily in terms of like, here's a checklist of what you need, but in a shared mental model of here's how intake into a design process works, the more other people understand that, the more of a good time you're going to have and the better work you're going to be able to do. Because essentially, if you don't have a good definition of your process from an intake perspective, people are going to bring you garbage. People are going to bring you whatever thoughts go through their head. People are going to bring you vibe-coded prototypes and ask you to add design to them. And you've essentially caused yourself to become a QA person for other people's ideas. Whereas if you have a more well-defined intake, you are avoiding having those responsibilities shifted onto you downstream from those requesters. If you're able to articulate, hey, your brief is missing a hypothesis. This is the format of a hypothesis. It's, a public format. I didn't just make this up. It's a public format. It's on the Confluence. Go look at it. Can you give me a statement shaped like this? If you're having trouble writing it, we can do a one-on-one meeting. By the way, I've just snuck a workshop under your calendar. I didn't call it a workshop, but that's what happened. We've come out of that workshop with a hypothesis. You can start to work it from that angle. But if you, quote unquote, don't have a process and you're just doing everything sort of automatically, you've just taken on all of the work of refining the request. And that refinement work, in addition to being a burden on your time, also makes a ton of assumptions. And then when you bring the artifact back to the requester, they're like, well, this is bad because it doesn't fit my assumptions. And maybe those assumptions that they had were wrong. Maybe your assumptions are actually way better than their assumptions. But because you have a mismatch in your mental models, it's going to be really hard for you to convince them that the thing you made is good if it doesn't fit their definition. And this is also going to be in the workshop, by the way. So I'm basically giving paid content away for free right now, and you should just bleep out like the past half an hour of everything that I've said. But that's kind of the approach I've taken in the past, and it works pretty well. And a big part of why it works is because the first thing you need to know about design is social. And this is why I'm not particularly bothered about bootcamp people entering the industry, because the bootcamp does not teach you how to interact with stakeholders. And I mean, really, school doesn't either. And that is something you pick up in any role, really. It's the skill set of being an employee and of being a collaborator that you need to learn to be effective. And unless you learn that, you're not going to be effective. And I think part of why some bootcamp grads and many fresh grads from any kind of background face is they come in with a set of assumptions that they've imported from their previous set of experiences. And those set of assumptions really, worked well in design school for 4 years or worked well in your bootcamp program. And they fail completely in a work environment. You need to kind of re-engineer your process to fit a world where requirements are not clear, requirements are not necessarily articulated fully in advance. Requirements change. There is no brief. All the different constraints that you're familiar with as a professional who's been in the field for a very long time that don't exist in an academic environment and cannot and never will. And there's no good reason for them to exist there because it's a skill that you will pick up in the field. And it's a skill you can only pick up in the field.
I really like what you said about the dual purpose of a design process. One is internally for us designers to ensure that we're hitting the right activities and the right intentions of what we're doing. And the second one is to serve as an API to better communicate. Here is what we need from you, stakeholder, and here's what you're going to get out of it. Here's the outcome, not necessarily the output, but the outcome you're going to get if you give us quality input. I think it boils down to two of my favorite things, which is one, designers need to understand why they're there in order to create a good process for themselves and communicate it. And the second, they need to be able to talk to other people and collaborate with them and share that knowledge with them.
I think there's sort of a fairy tale conceptualization that designers have of design, and especially of senior designers. And when I say senior designers, I don't mean like someone was a senior experienced designer, which is the second lowest level of designer in our industry, but someone, like Johnny Ive. And I think that in the same way people think of Steve Jobs, they think of Johnny Ive. He's this magical person who can walk into a boardroom, dictate whatever the hell they want, say, I have good taste, therefore you should do it this way, and walk out. And everyone goes, wow, I should do it that way. That's never going to happen. That's not even how Johnny Ive would work, but it's certainly not how you will ever work. There is a lot of background work that happens to align stakeholders and align the team towards the same mental model, to the point where I think one of the biggest mistakes junior designers make is they come into a meeting expecting to sell stakeholders on an idea, and they fail. And the reason they fail is because that's not actually how things work. You are supposed to sell the stakeholders before the meeting. You should never surprise a more senior or more influential person when you present something. They should always be pre-aligned. The thing that happens at the meeting is they're giving their public recognition of the thing that they already agreed with you on in private. And they've given you their feedback. You've had a chance to implement their feedback or to discuss that feedback with them. And essentially what they're doing is they're giving you their seal of approval because they're comfortable with it. If you're surprising them with something, they're not comfortable with it. They need to sit with it for a bit. They need to think about it. And they're reluctant to say yes. And so they say no. And then you go, oh, they didn't really get it. And yeah, they didn't really get it. It's not because they don't like it. It's because they have not engaged with it in a way that they prefer to. If only they had a explicit process that they shared with the rest of the organization so that how this is supposed to work, this would be much easier. They don't. Doesn't mean there's no process. It means that the process is obscure and hidden, and you need to learn these things kind of through experience. But there it is. If you socialize ideas before you actually, go for the go or no-go decision, you're going to get way more go decisions. And if you don't, and you kind of ambush people with, I think we should do this, and other people have socialized their decisions, you're always going to lose.
So with that, Pavel, you already mentioned the exquisite weekly newsletter, Product Picnic. I urge everyone to go sign up for that. The workshop you're doing at the end of July with Active Voice HQ, which again sounds wonderful. You and Sarah Wachter-Betcher. Anything else you'd like to plug?
Not really. Support your local library. That's what I'm going to say. You covered the important points.
Thank you so much for your time, Pavel. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.